There's not much information in the book around the affective skills, and that's because we needed some time to build on that. The affective skills, the cognitive skills we had been talking about for some time, but the affective skills was fairly new to us. Since the book has come out, Mary especially, Cindy, Burnett, one of the wonderful things about having a team is that we're not the only ones working on this. But Mary, Cindy, Janice, Francisco have been doing much more in terms of exploring the affective side of creative problem solving. So with that, I'll turn it to Mary.
Okey-doke. Just briefly about how the affect, got back in here. Gerard talked way earlier about the fact that things come in waves. He talked about his own experience with creative problem solving, and then over my 20-year career, I've seen certain approaches and ways to do things and certain models, and change is a good thing, and people take their thinking and they move with it. But what we were seeing as we started to work on the thinking skills model again was that that it seemed like the affective had been squeezed out over some period of time. And if not squeezed out, then at least not paid as much attention to deliberately. If you go back to some of the original work, or some of the original Parnes work, certainly, and I'm sure some of you in 670 have seen some of those original pieces, Guide to Creative Action, the 68 and the 77 kinds of things, you'll see that all that stuff was there, discussed and talked about, and there was research present on it even then. And so what we wanted to do was bring that back forward again and help to make people more aware of it and help them to understand it better. Real briefly, our definition is a classic one of what we mean by affect as well, too. We use the old Krathwohl, and so far it's worked in theory and practice on everything I've tested out so far. So we don't just simply mean emotions or how you feel. It means how people receive information, e.g., you can cross your arms and say, no way am I letting this in, or you can be open and say, isn't that interesting? How you respond, then Gerard was describing what he said about management, the first thing off the top of his head, and then he realized how he had received and responded in all of that, and he corrected course after his receiving and responding, and what you value. So those are the three things. All that's in first edition. Now, if you see the slides that are coming next, I'm simply showing them to you just to remind you. In the first edition, here's where we were. So if you take a look at what we call the Magnificent Seven, we then began to say, what are some of the key skills that might be causing people to respond or react or value or show something that would drive or help warm up or introduce and assist the cognitive skills. And so that's where and how we came up with the Magnificent Seven. It was based on our own experience. It was based on the literature initially, and then follow up in the literature later on. So we looked at what we thought was a key something you'd need to know, but again, not the only thing. And so those were the first ones, and they were used as assisters, and they're still sort of used as assisters. Now, if you look at the next slide, again, in first edition, so y'all are all familiar with this at this point, then we called it the Big Three, because what we saw happening was, yes, it's true. We think that you can pinpoint a couple of things, not all of them nearly, and we weren't trying to, that go with each step and stage to help us focus, but that there were certain things you had to have that seemed to underlie the creative problem-solving process altogether. And these go back to Mumford and his colleagues and what they had to say and do as well. So you see that openness to novelty, tolerance for ambiguity, and tolerance for complexity. And you also see that these are broader kinds of concepts as well, too, with a lot of things packed in them. So we had, in the first edition, the Magnificent Seven to go with each step and the Big Three. Now let's take a quick look at the changes that are occurring at this point. Inside the actual theoretical model, the thinking skills model that you see that is one graphic, the skills, Magnificent Seven skills remain the same. But one way that our thinking has changed, and Gerard alluded to this earlier, is that we are now really trying to be more integrative, how things fit together in a holistic kind of pattern rather than how they're pulled apart to only analyze them. So the concept is, it kind of comes from Swarmer. By the way, if you haven't seen the newer stuff on Theory U, he's got a couple of books out on Theory U. And the Presencing book that Singy and Swarmer and a couple of other folks did also really deals with this issue, the concept that the whole is not simply the sum of its parts, that it actually is something different, which is a much more amenable definition to how things operate in creativity and creative problem solving. It's not just one piece that you can pull apart. We can always pull apart and analyze, but when you go to practice, these things work together, much like climate works on it. So the phrase currently that I've been working with is integrating. And I went back to the old six-pack. There's a lot of this that we're still working on, but it was like, okay, now let's look at what's going on here. So you'll see what we discussed, what Gerard and Marie and I discussed, and Dr. Zachary Smith was, I think, with us through part of this as well, too, was that it's not just the big three. It's not just affective things that underlie creative problem solving, but there's some things you have to be ready for. This is a skill and a teaching and training issue. And if people aren't ready, you in the audience, myself sitting here, those people we try to train and work with, if they're not ready to receive and respond and value, then we all have our work cut out for us. And we all know what that sort of thing is like. Tools and techniques oftentimes will take care of some of that. You get a tool and it works. What it's actually doing is a lot of integrative things cognitively and affectively and giving you an outcome. And I think that's why people are so enamored with tools as well too, which is, tools are great. But what lies behind them that you want to teach people about in their thinking? So here's what we're looking at now, and they're somewhat diverse. And calling them readiness skills. Dispositions are thinking habits. So some are more skills. Some are more dispositions, which means an inclination toward or a habit you can develop. You can develop your thinking and affective habits and inclinations in a very similar way to how you develop other things. You can develop how you approach what it takes to suspend judgment or not, should you choose and be motivated to enter that. So we believe that you have to have, we're saying, okay, metacognition has to run throughout. And if you look at the thinking skills model, you'll see deciding and making decisions goes all the way throughout, whether about process or about content. So we're looking at that as a readiness skill. Emotional intelligence, for want of a better word at this point, but it really is awareness and the management of yourself. That's part of that receiving and responding. People have to be ready to do that, or they're not going to be able to maybe get any benefit, but certainly not full benefit, and those are learnable skills. Divergent convergent has been around a long time, but we're putting it, of course, because it undergirds everything in terms of CPS process, that runs throughout. And then you'll notice the three that were in the big three also continue to run throughout. And there's stuff that we're not going into here for second edition today, but we have characteristics, qualities, and how these things operate. And so we call these now dispositions, meaning they're not skills, but they're attitudes that you have to have. And again, these come from Mumford. So that's our current thinking right now for second edition, is that we're looking for those things that will provide readiness and awareness. A lot of those things happen when you set up a climate, for example, and you do things that are warming up or getting people ready. What's happening are a lot of these affective things are being taken care of in an activity, in a tool, and they'll be taken care of for some people at least on a temporary basis. And then for those of you who are experienced in this kind of facilitation, you're going to see that they may work for some people, but you may still be having folks out there going, hey, I'm not buying this. This is silly. I'm not going to do it. All the reasons why they won't do things. So that's how we're coming at more integrative overall, both in terms of leadership and management, and in the readiness that it takes to do those things.